Deputy Brid Smith.
I have a global perspective.
Global perspective.
Yes, absolutely.
My apologies, Deputy Smith.
None of your small world things for me. I'm all over the world tonight. I want to start by talking about I like that programme early on a Saturday morning that looks at country life and talks to different farmers. And recently it went all over Ireland talking to farmers about the fodder crisis. And the honesty of the farmers involved was quite impressive. And an awful lot of them were saying, we are being stretched beyond our capacity. And the message I was getting from those ordinary families who are being interviewed, family farmers who are struggling with what sounded like horrific reality on a day-to-day basis, pulling dead animals out of their farms, farmers and their wives literally crying because the animals were dying in front of them from starvation. And one woman I remember describing the howls of the animals with the hunger. I think that must be a terrible, painful thing to go through, no matter how callous a person you are. But I don't believe that the farmers of this country, particularly the smaller and medium-sized farmers, are in any way callous. And so the honesty that they were portraying was to say that there is a problem in this country, that farmers are being consistently driven to being stretched beyond their capability, not just by the Department of Agriculture and the governments and the policy that comes from this House, but also sometimes from their own organisations and sometimes from the Farmers' Journal and others saying, now is the time, grow more cows, get into this is now the time to do it. But as we've heard tonight from people who are more familiar with rural Ireland than I am, the smaller and medium-sized farmer does not gain. Maybe Larry Goodman, who we've bailed out in the past, who's after winning most of the big contract to China this week, will do very nicely, thank you very much. But the smaller, medium-sized farmer is struggling to meet the capacity to which they are being stretched. And I think there's a real problem with that. In June 2017, there was 7.3 million cattle, and that was an increase of 10% on cattle over 2 years of age, and 3% of cattle under 2 years of age, and 2.5% of dairy cows. Now, in anybody's estimation, in a country this size, that is overproduction in the middle of climate change. And this is where my global point comes in. That on the one hand, and I, along with Deputy Stanley and others, are on the Climate Change Committee. On the one hand, we agonise in a big way about climate change and how we're going to reduce our emissions, but on the other hand, the policy of the Department of Agriculture is to get everybody to grow more cattle, get everybody into exporting the cattle, do these major deals. And you remember Ceann Comhairle last year or the year before, when Ibrahim Alawa was still in prison in Egypt. I complained bitterly that this government seemed to be able to do export deals of an enormous scale for cattle with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, but didn't seem to be able to deal with the incarceration of one of its own citizens in the same country. And only this week we've seen an opening up, and the minister who's sitting there said, is our oyster, pardon the pun, in terms of cattle exports. This is only the tip of the iceberg. He's quoted all over the media. We all woke up on Monday morning to Minister Mr. Creed's after making this great discovery that we can push beef on a population, the biggest population in the world, who've never eaten beef before. We can push beef into the Middle East on the population who usually live off sheep and goats. We don't even begin to think globally about what food production, the crazy levels of food production and the changes in food production are actually doing both to the health of the population of the planet, but most importantly to climate change. And I want to finish just on the, well, no, actually I don't want to finish on this point. I want to read from what I thought was the most interesting bit I found on the internet. The ICMSA have said that the knackeries are flat out collecting dead animals, which shows how bad things are. And if the minister is in any doubt, he should talk to the people at the coalface. Equally, it is the case that even where there is fodder, the long winters and the atrocious weather have led to the increased levels of animal disease such as pneumonia. The President said that it's now time to stop the relentless focus at all costs on increased production and even higher stocking rates. and I quote him, "We are witnessing those consequences now, and with 2 crises in the last 5 years, the trend is bound to continue. Glorifying rapid dairy expansion, as soon as the weather gets bad, the wheel comes off. There's a knock-on impact on all other farmers, as the big operators then have to panic to buy off the large quantities of feed at any cost." And I finish as quoting him saying, "There is no doubt that this crisis is having an animal welfare impact, and farmers no longer want to hear about a transport subsidy that hasn't worked. They need subsidies to buy feed now. And obviously you were sitting on the crisis long enough, responded too late, and this is why you're getting such a huge reaction to it." But I also just want to, and I do want to finish on this point on the question of climate change. In October 2013, after the last big fodder crisis, a researcher, Dr. Stephen Flood, warned that severe future impacts of climate change on Irish agriculture would see a repeat of this type of crisis. Climate-fuelled extreme weather conditions, from hurricanes to major flooding episodes and unseasonal cold snaps, batter Ireland with monotonous regularity, hitting the agricultural sector hardest. The de facto position of Ireland's major farmer group appears one of outright denial of the dangerous reality of climate change. And this is where, when the Fianna Fáil motions start by saying we can't blame you or the government for the weather, Minister, I disagree. I think that we can't blame you directly for the weather on a daily basis, but we can blame you and the government, who keep their eyes shut and their ears shut to the reality of climate change and push our policies in an opposite direction. We need to wake up and smell the coffee and start dealing with what is a reality in this country, and that is we are hurtling towards not just severe climate change on a global level, and you should talk to your EU friends about this, because actually Minister Hogan has admitted it many times over that there is far too much emissions from growing cattle coming from Ireland. And I'm quoting Minister Hogan, who tried to push the water charges on us, but he's now out in Europe doing his damnedest to make sure that Larry Goodman gets loads of agricultural exports. He recently warned of unsustainable levels in milk production, and that Ireland is sleepwalking towards massive EU emission fines. By emission fines, he means we are producing too many cows. Cows produce carbon emissions, they fart a lot, and the methane destroys the atmosphere. And I think we have to take note of that, and we have to start thinking globally about what sort of food policies, what sort of agricultural policies will amend this situation, not just to deal with climate change, but to deal with the reality that the ICMSA describe as the daily reality for the small and medium farmers in this country. Not the big guys whom you're looking after, forget about that, that's not whom we need to address tonight. It's the small farmers and the ones who are being crucified by the fodder crisis, by the climate change, and by the reality of having to deal with policies that do not serve them well.
Deputy Smith. Deputy Thomas Pringle.